Alberta Premier Jason Kenney says he's optimistic about our province's future, even though we're running a massive deficit and debt. The Premier also recently announced more funding to support seniors' continuing care to the tune of $200 million. To discuss this in more detail is our legislative reporter and the Alberta correspondent with the National Post, Tyler Dawson, joining me once again from Edmonton. Tyler, the province has been boosting spending on healthcare, which should win the UCP a few votes.
You would think so, yeah. I spoke to a source recently who said that their sort of fiscal plan has just been blown out of the water by the pandemic. Not just because it delayed the economic recovery of the province, but also because there's just had to be so much government spending to keep things going. So, budget 2021, I think, is probably going to be a very typical pandemic budget across the country. About $18.5 billion, pardon me, in deficit spending this year, deficits to continue for the next few years, and the overall debt something like 115 billion by the end of 2021-22. But as you say, in spite of all of this, I spoke to Jason Kenney recently, and he's still pretty optimistic, pointing to the entrepreneurial spirit of Albertans, saying that we still have a young, educated, motivated workforce. So there's all that, and of course, oil's been going up a little bit lately. So the premier, maybe a little bit surprisingly, seems like he's feeling pretty good about things right now.
Now, Tyler, the recent budget included cuts amounting to $72 million to post-secondary. Now, the NDP obviously jumped onto that ship, as have student groups who are calling for the government to reverse its decision, and around, 750 jobs will also vanish, but that's more due to attrition, right?
Yeah, there's kind of a complicated bit of numbers happening here, and the gist of it is that the overall operating budget is down about 5% or something like that. Let me just check here. About 5% down. So they need to make this up with job cuts and sort of this reduction in funding. So yes, the 750 jobs supposed to be attrition. So that's people retiring, leaving for other jobs, things like that. But it comes on a second hard year for post-secondary and for students. And we talked recently about how there was this sort of issue of a little bit of brain drain maybe from Alberta young people thinking they didn't see any opportunities here. So, there's, I think, a handful of issues sort of circulating around post-secondary, and the NDP, as you say, is really seizing upon it.
Now, there's talk of a potential provincial sales tax to help balance the books. That's a major no-no to a lot of Albertans that I speak with here. That's the Alberta advantage. We don't have a PST. But the government, however, is saying, maybe a PST brought forth can maybe help us balance the books, but nothing would ever happen outside of a referendum, correct?
That is correct. The political suicide tax, I've heard it called around the legislature. Not a super popular idea among UCP folks. But there certainly is a discussion happening right now about what the province is going to do about its revenues. Get off the oil royalty roller coaster and get more stable sort of government funding. So, the conversation about an HST or a PST, as you say, these are the sort of things that would go to a referendum most likely. It's hard to imagine, I think, that the government is going to be able to sort of cut its way back to deficit, to no deficit, and then cut our way out of $115 billion in debt. So, I think revenue is going to be part of the discussion. Whether or not that ends up being I was going to say political suicide tax. Whether or not that ends up being a PST or an HST, I think very much remains to be seen. The premier certainly does not seem to be a big fan of the idea.
Now, in your inner circle there at the legislature, have you heard any talk of maybe investing more in agriculture, which we're pretty pumped about down here in southwestern Alberta, in Lethbridge, and even southeastern Alberta, Medicine Hat, as opposed to relying on the oil revenue, like you said earlier?
Yeah, it's got to be like the second or third largest industry in the province. There has been a bunch of movement around agricultural research. That's the thing that comes sort of straight to mind, that there were some projects in, I think, Olds and Lethbridge and Brooks maybe as well, just sort of moving some of the agricultural research stuff out of the government and into these sort of post-secondary higher education institutions. So it's certainly a topic of conversation. And there is also, contingency funding for disasters and things like that when it comes to agriculture. But, have I heard anything that big and breaking about there being programs to start up new farms or help out ranchers and stuff? I would say that that's not something that's made its way to my ears just yet, but that doesn't mean that that kind of stuff isn't in the works.
Okay, let's go back for just a moment and have some fun talking about a potential PST. You know, it's
Hmm.
funny. Anybody in my family says, "Get out the door now, hell, leave now." I don't even want to hear about it, right? But the Alberta Party, which still doesn't have a leader since Stephen Mandel stepped down, argued in a shadow budget for a 6% HST, which would help get Alberta a little closer back to black, as opposed to seeing so much red ink.
Yeah, a little closer. Not much by their projections. I think they said they would run about a $16 billion deficit as opposed to an $18.5 billion deficit.
Right.
But obviously, this would allow for a little bit more spending, a little bit less restraint here and there. And yeah, shadow budget's always a bit of an odd thing. They don't have sort of the resources that the government does, or even the official opposition. So it was like a 30-page document or something outlining what they thought. But the reason it really caught my eye is because the HST is a difficult sell for the NDP and for the UCP. So it's one of those issues that almost feels like a third party needs to broach if it's ever going to gain traction. Not saying it should or shouldn't, but it's like the sharks circling. They've been circling for so long, and the Alberta Liberals are the first, or the Alberta Party, I should say, is the first one to sort of seemingly, at least recently, bring it up and mention it.
So, Tyler, the Alberta Party's trying to drum up some support with constituency events. And who's the interim leader right now?
Jackie Fensky is the interim leader right now, and presumably they're going to have to come up with who the new one is going to be. I believe they'd sort of postponed it because of the pandemic. But yeah, they're holding some events. They're having let's talk about a provincial sales tax event in a few days here, meeting with some constituency associations and stuff like that. So, things still going on in the background with I guess they'd be the third party probably, technically, but certainly not getting as much airtime as they would if they'd managed to get someone back in the legislature.
A Calgary MLA, Mohammed Yassin, would like to make rodeo the official sport here in our province in Alberta. He's even introduced a private member's bill on the topic. Will it receive much traction? What are your thoughts?
It certainly got a lot of conversation. I don't know if it'll end up getting traction, but it generated a lot of feedback and response on social media and things like that. I mean, what's more Albertan than rodeo? Some of the critics pointing out that, in fact, rodeo is not a single sport like football or hockey. It is, in fact, a entire event with numerous sports. But he'd sort of spoken about growing up and loving the rodeo, and then also sort of speaking a little bit about the economic hard times that rodeos are having. I mean, lots of people who travel on the international rodeo circuit, things like that, haven't been able to do so. Obviously, gatherings. So there's a couple of reasons why he sort of wants it to be, up for discussion right now. Flip side of that, of course, is that rodeos are always very controversial. Animal rights activists don't like them and things like that. So it'll have to sort of go through the committee phase before it ends up before the legislature. Private members' bills don't kind of just, get debate right off the bat. So we'll have to wait and see. And it's also worth pointing out that this was tried in 2008. Then Liberal leader Kevin Taft tried to bring this up, and it didn't really go anywhere. It was sort of a non-binding motion. So who knows? Maybe this time around it'll have a little more luck.
The many years that I spent in radio, I covered a lot of the rodeos, and I interviewed a lot of the cowboys and a lot of the rodeo performers. And I remember I interviewed a couple of bareback riders, and this one bull rider. I said, "You're going onto this bull. It's 800 pounds. What are you doing?" He said, "Well, it's fun, Hal. You should try it." Then he looks at me. One of the guys says, "Hey, you're a pretty big guy. What are you, about 6'4"? I said, "Yeah, I'm about 6'4". You should be a bulldogger." So what's a bulldogger? Steer wrestler. There you go. I learned quite a bit when I covered a lot of these rodeos here.
They're tougher men than you and I think.
Yeah. The province is being sued, and it has a lot to do with opioids. Can you share some of the details?
Yeah, so this is another sort of complicated little thing going on. The gist of it is the NDP started a program called the IOAT program, and that's injectable hydromorphone. So it's sort of a last-ditch treatment for someone who has an opioid addiction who has been unsuccessful on something like methadone. There's, I believe, at the moment, about 88 people who are in this program. Now, when the UCP came in, they said this is an NDP pilot project. It's going to continue until March 2021, and then we're going to sort of transition them into other programming. This caused quite a large controversy among the New Democrats, among activists who work with the drug using communities and things like that. And so there is a lawsuit going on that has been not altogether successful, but they are fighting the government, saying that this is necessary treatment. It's a violation of their charter rights to get rid of it. So what seems to have happened in the last couple days is the government has decided to extend the program another 2 years with a $6 million grant. The court stuff still sort of shaking out. The people seeking to continue the program actually lost fighting for an injunction that would have stopped that would have, if they'd won the injunction, it would have kept the program going. They lost that. The program's going ahead anyways, and the lawyers have appealed that. So there's still some sort of legal stuff going on in the background, but the brass tacks of it is that the program is going to continue for the time being.
Health Minister Tyler Shandro announced recently that our province has rolled out phase 2 of relaxing some of the restrictions, but many Albertans say, Tyler, it's not near enough, especially a lot of the restaurant owners I've spoken to, the theatre owners. Now, as for gyms, Shandro says, yeah, you can go back and work out as long as you don't elevate your heart rate too much. But Tyler, isn't that the idea behind a workout? You got to elevate the heart rate, work up a sweat?
Well, yeah, it is. It's a bit of a confusing thing, that gym operators were sort of looking at opening, unsure what they were allowed to do. And it seems to have sort of come down, as with so many other things, to just sort of owners are going to need to make these decisions for themselves, what they're going to allow. Are you going to allow people sprinting on a treadmill? Probably not. But is, a walk on a treadmill probably okay? So it is certainly a little bit confusing. There was a lot of confusion among gym owners and especially group fitness studios the last couple of days, trying to figure out what exactly they were allowed to do, whether or not people had to wear masks, things like that. So, a little bit of a hiccup, I would say, actually, in this reopening. But numbers coming down. So, yeah, we might see more stuff opening up. I had dinner at a restaurant for the first time a couple weeks ago, and let me tell you, it felt real strange.
Yeah, I can imagine. Manitoba's actually opening up many businesses, including restaurants, to 50% capacity as long as you're sitting down with the same household. So if you got a big family, you're laughing, I guess, 12, 14 members of your family. But when will our province open up a little bit more? What are you hearing right now? Because like I said earlier, so many business owners are really struggling across the province.
Yeah, no doubt the premier is concerned about this, I think would be totally fair to say. When I spoke to him, he's very cognizant of the damage, I suppose you might say, that is being caused by these policies. They are also, trying to very consistently link any decisions they make to the evidence. I think probably, out of the goodness of their heart, because they don't want things to get worse, but also to avoid any sort of political attacks on it. So I haven't heard anything about imminent reopenings, but it's absolutely at the front of everybody's mind in government that I've spoken with. And of course, also linked to the vaccine rollout when we're going to get, much larger shipments and things like that. So I imagine there's a little bit of frustration right now. So many things outside of the government's control.
And it's interesting, you see other, like down in the United States, other countries, Texas and Mississippi, they're opening up 100% and taking off the masks. And, a lot of Albertans are looking down at Texas saying, hey, we should be doing that right now. Tyler, it appears as though Alberta politics are becoming a little heated once again. Edmonton MLA Janice Irwin had Antifa and liars sprayed on her constituency office. Kenney condemned the act and residents helped to clean it up. Why would somebody connect Irwin with Antifa?
It's a strange thing, and I have to admit I struggle to understand it as well. I think there's this idea that the NDP are, sort of a radical left-wing party, which I would say is not especially true, and that they are, in league with Antifa and things like that, which, also doesn't strike me as especially true. So I think probably what the issue is here is that, tempers and frustrations and stuff are they're boiling over at this point when it comes to the lockdowns, when it comes to the pandemic, when it comes to the economy. And I think good on Kenney for condemning it because, he's in government and he has, I think, a lot of the responsibility to try and, shall we say, soothe some of these tempers. It's a difficult position for him, no doubt. It's a difficult position for any politician. But as he pointed out, there's lots of other ways to express your displeasure. You can write a letter or something like that instead of vandalizing someone's constituency office.
One more thing I wanted to ask you. Let's talk about the heated rivalry between Kenney and Notley at the Ledge. Are they getting along well? Or are they still taking some good shots at each other?
They don't seem to be getting along. I spoke to Rachel Notley the other week too, and I asked her about Jim Prentice and saying Albertans needed to look in the mirror. And I said, what do you think of that statement 6 years later? Because it was about 6 years ago, like this week, I think. And She said, you know, the problem with Kenney is that he's been telling Albertans they need to look in the mirror instead of, he's been downloading costs onto municipalities. He's been forcing people to pay more. You know, she was as bullish as I've ever seen her, actually. You know, this government has not had a whole lot of slack from the opposition for the past year, that's for sure.
Our legislative reporter and the Alberta correspondent with the National Post, Tyler Dawson, thanks for your time today.
Always a pleasure, Hal.
On behalf of all of us here at Bridge City News, I'm Hal Roberts. God bless and thanks for watching.